Whether you're trying to stride, fly, or swim, all of these are movement actions, but when you're being chased, chasing some adversaries yourself, or trying to beat a clock, it can be a bit cumbersome and a bit chaotic. If that is the situation that you find yourself in, then you might want to look into the chase subsystem, and it's helpful for GMs and players alike to understand how they work and how it can add to the suspense and challenge of overcoming obstacles in a thrilling chase scene right out of a movie. This particular subsystem is part of the Gamemastery guide, and I'll reference the pages in the description below. But my name is Don, and I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. As a bit of an overview, let's go ahead and discuss a little bit what a chase is. So the speed rules in the core rule book are, pretty effective for small movements. You're kind of in a confined room. There's fairly clear terrain. They might be difficult terrain, but you're not trying to run through a city or through a crowded market or through a swamp or through a cavern that has collapsed caves and obstacles all along the way. And when you're covering longer distances in these more complex environments, it can get very, very complicated with both the player characters and the creatures having multiple different movement rates, multiple different movement types, and these specific abilities to all these particular creatures can get very complicated very quickly. The chase subsystem shifts the focus from movement speed and individual movement skills to confronting particular obstacles that might be in a way that would be more realistic for a prolonged pursuit. Once again, market crowds, collapsed caves, or that unexpected mud pit that you just kind of happen to come across in a forest. And this allows you to create that chase scene that you want. Chases are a very distinct type of encounter where the pursued characters take their actions first in a round, followed by the pursuing characters. So the regular rules of initiative don't necessarily apply here. It is always going to be the pursued going before the pursuers. Typically, to minimize the variation that could happen because of the different movement speeds and different movement types, player characters roll checks to make progress while their opponents advance at a steady pace. So you might critically succeed on your roll as a party and move 2 obstacles or 2 chase points in order to overcome an obstacle, while your pursuers would just tick through each obstacle after a certain specified period of round, which will be decided by the GM depending on how far behind the pursuers are, how difficult the obstacles are, a whole bunch of different variables. But if you want to highlight a little bit of back and forth and create a little bit more tension, the GM could also roll for the pursuers, whatever the adversaries are or whatever the creatures are, in order to kind of create a little back and forth as opposed to a steady drumbeat. One would add more tension and one would add more suspense. Because there is no initiative, characters in the same group can act in whatever order they prefer. So if it helps for one character to buff the entire party before everybody tries to overcome an obstacle, that's perfectly fine. But it is crucial for characters to take an action on their turn. Delaying really isn't an option here because failing to act or being unable to act results in an inability to work with the group and to assist, and it automatically causes the group to lose 1 chase point. And depending on the scope of the chase, the GM would need to establish the duration of each round at the beginning, ensuring that the characters who are trying to overcome these obstacles are realistic in what they can achieve in that time. Because this is not an initiative order type of combat, which would be 6 seconds for each round, in this, each round might be a minute. It might be 10 minutes. Possibly could be even days. So each round could represent a 3-action turn or be as long as a day in order to overcome an obstacle, depending on how long you wanted this particular chase to last in a timeline. Now that we've kind of established what a chase is in general, we'll be getting more specific on some things, including chase points, so don't worry about that. But I'm going to go a little bit out of order from the Game Mastery Guide, and I want to cover the types of chases first. Now, there are 4 basic types of chases in the Game Mastery Guide. There are some that you might come up with that might not fit one of these categories, and if that's the case, feel free to create it how you would like to create it. But the 4 that they generally cover are a chase down, running away, a beat the clock scenario, and a competitive chase. So we'll start with the chase down. In a chase down, the player characters are the ones who are pursuing a retreating foe or retreating adversaries. In this case, the player characters would go second, while the adversaries would be the ones that go first. So you would basically, as an example, you would start the adversaries 1 obstacle ahead of the PCs, or potentially at the same location for a very short chase, as long as you are aware that the pursued goes first, and end the chase if any of the player characters catch up to the enemies, or if the enemies reach a certain point. Let's say you established a hideout or a hidden tunnel or the entrance to the sewers. That might be where this particular chase ends. Once the adversaries reach this particular endpoint, that is where the chase would end. Another one would be a runaway scenario. In this case, it is the opposite of the chase down, in that the player characters are the ones who are trying to escape and they are being chased by adversaries. In this case, it'd be the same thing, except the player characters would go first. Usually the adversaries would be an obstacle at least behind. Once again, you could possibly have it start at the same time if it was very short or you wanted a lot of tension. However, you would have a set number of obstacles, and once the player characters beat all these obstacles, or they made it to a certain obstacle without being caught by the adversaries, once again, hidden location, a hideout, entrance to sewers, something that would end the chase, then at that point, the chase is over. And then the last 2 are kind of variations on the same thing. The first one is beat the clock. So it could be that the player characters are going through a dungeon and they have 10 minutes to get from where they started to the entrance before the whole system collapsed because of some type of self-destruct mechanism. If that's the case, then you would have a certain amount of obstacles and you would determine the time frame for each obstacle. Let's say it was 10 minutes to get out, and you would put 3 obstacles in place. In that case, the player characters would have 3 possible rounds to overcome each one of the obstacles in order to get to the entrance, in order to not be in the collapsed cave when it goes, is an option. As well as you could also do the number of obstacles can be equal to the exact number of rounds, which is going to create a lot of tension and a lot of drama into this particular type of chase. And then another one, and I say it's similar to beat the clock because whether it is happening side by side or whether it is happening 2 o'clock trying to beat someone else's best time, this is called a competitive chase. In this case, the player characters and the adversaries would start at the same location, but instead of chasing each other, they are trying to get to something. Maybe it is the treasure, or maybe it is the wand or the chalice that signifies that they won the competition at a fair. But either way, they start at the same time and they each have the same number of obstacles in order to get to this end goal. And when they get to the end goal, whoever gets there first would be considered the winning party. Because in some of these cases, there would be more than one set of pursuers, you might have the player characters and their competitors roll for initiative to decide which one of them goes first. And whoever gets to go first is going to have the advantage in a competitive chase. Now that that's over, let's kind of lean into the obstacles a little bit. So in these chases, basically what you want to do is you want to set up a series of obstacles that the player characters have to overcome. And these obstacles are there to present challenges, and they could be anything from a locked door to, once again, those mud pits or marshes or swampy areas, collapsed tunnels, crowded marketplaces, a roaming band of thugs. These obstacles aren't necessarily set up on 100-yard chase scene and every 10 yards. It is more described narratively, and it can vary between the obstacles because, once again, it is not the movement speed that matters so much. It is you overcome obstacle 1, and then you move to obstacle 2, and you defeat obstacle 2, and then you move to obstacle 3. And the distance between them is more described narratively rather than a physical representation. And this is where we'll get into chase points. So what you would do is, for each one of the obstacles, depending on how many they were and how difficult you want it to be to overcome, you would assign a certain number of chase points to each obstacle. So let's say your first obstacle was a locked door. Well, that locked door, generally speaking, is going to be 1 per party member for a standard obstacle. So if you had a 4-person party, there would be 4 chase points that would be required to be done in order to overcome that locked door. Each one of your players is going to take a turn in their round, and this has multiple success conditions, kind of just like everything else. It has a critical success. On a critical success, the player characters gain 2 chase points. On a success, they would gain 1 chase point. On a failure, they would get none. And on a critical failure, they would actually lose a chase point. So your player characters would have to come up with 4 total chase points in order to overcome that obstacle to move to the next one. If it is a more difficult obstacle, you could have more chase points, which would require them to spend multiple rounds or hope for multiple critical successes. One thing I will say about the critical failure is that for a critical failure, yes, you lose a chase point, but at no point should you really put the player characters below 0. So they shouldn't ever go negative. And there are multiple ways to earn chase points for each one of the particular obstacles in a lot of cases. A locked door, they could pick the lock, or they could attempt to break the door down. If it is a guard, they could try to intimidate, they could try to bribe, and they could try diplomacy in order to go through. If it is a crowded market, they could intimidate to go through, they could use athletics and try to push through, or potentially they could use their societal knowledge in order to just go with the crowd and be able to overcome that particular obstacle. So there are multiple ways each one of the obstacles should be able to be bypassed, depending on the strength of each one of the player characters. And chase points represent the collective ability of the entire group as they're trying to overcome that particular obstacle. So if a character critically succeeds, then they not only earn their 2 chase points, well, then another character might be able to aid yet another player character in order to try to get through the same obstacle to earn those 4 chase points in order to overcome that obstacle. Or maybe it's a harder obstacle and there'd be 8. Or maybe it's a larger group and there'd be 5. If a player character comes up with a creative way to overcome an obstacle that might not be specifically defined in the stat block of that particular obstacle, then it is the GM's decision to allow that to happen, as well as what the role would be and the difficulty class needed to overcome. Once the player characters have accumulated enough of these chase points to overcome an obstacle, then they would immediately move to the next one. But you're doing this through narrative. Once again, it's not a time-based thing. It would be the GM describing how they burst past the crowded market into the open street and were able to run at full speed until they came across an overturned apple cart, which would be the next obstacle. In a lot of cases, it's helpful as a GM to have your obstacles defined in stat blocks so you know what your previously thought of DCs are. For example, that they give in the book would be a crowd, and that would require 4 chase points for a regular 4-person party. In order to overcome it, you would need a DC 15 acrobatics or athletics to weave through or push through, or a DC 13 society roll in order to follow the flow of the crowd. Two things that could come up either when you're building or when you're actually running a chase scene that can make it a little bit different are shortcuts and split paths, as well as solo chases. So let's go ahead and talk about those a little bit. So it can be interesting to have a chase scene. Let's say I have a chase scene that the road follows kind of like a little horseshoe there, but there's a hidden little alleyway that would cross that particular horseshoe. So it could be interesting to have maybe the rogue of the party or someone with keen eyes roll and see if they can't find that secret passageway and be able to take that shortcut in order to get well ahead of the pursuers, or perhaps the pursuers who have fallen behind have found that shortcut in order to raise the tension. There's also split paths. Let's say you have a fork in the road, or more like a Y that would come back together at the end towards the end goal. Well, you could have the player characters go one way and the adversaries could go another way, depending on maybe a random roll of the dice. But these are things that can add to that particular chase scene. And then there are solo chases that you can do. Sometimes circumstances might require you to run a chase where the player characters are moving individually rather than as a group. In that case, it's pretty much the same, except your DCs, once again, would be probably adjusted a little bit lower. Otherwise, it would take, at a minimum, for a 4 chase point door, it would, at a minimum, considering 2 critical successes, that it would be 2 rounds. But you would basically run your solo chases. It would take a lot longer. It would be a lot more involved, but it is something that can happen. Either you intentionally ran it as a solo chase, or perhaps one player character fell behind, and at that point, they are doing a chase all on their own. So in a solo chase, it is often beneficial to allow even a single success to allow the character to progress to the next obstacle, and a critical success might give the character a +2 circumstance bonus on their first check against the next obstacle. And that is pretty much a suggestion from the Game Mastery Guide. Otherwise, it would become very complicated and kind of hard to track, and would probably not be so much fun for the player character who would inevitably be caught in a lot of these cases. Now let's go ahead and move on to a little bit for the Game Masters, which would be building chases. I'm not going to go too far into it because this is more of a general guide, but we'll just mention a little bit. If you're building your own chase scene, one of the first things you want to do is you want to establish what obstacles you would like to have, how far ahead you want the pursued party to be ahead of the pursuing party, and what pace the non-player characters would go compared to the player characters. Do the NPCs clear 1 obstacle per round? Does it take 3 rounds for each one of the obstacles to be overcome by the NPCs? These are things you would decide at that point. Variety is always nice for these things. If you had a chase that was nothing but a series of locked doors, in some situations it could make sense. If you were doing a underground vault, or you were doing something that was heavily secured like a guard tower or guard barracks, then that could make sense. But in a lot of cases, it's nice to vary the different types of obstacles that they have to overcome, mainly because you are working with player characters, and the player characters are all going to have different skills. If it is just nothing but locked doors, you're going to be relying on the rogue or whoever has a thievery skill in order to try to overcome these obstacles. And if no one in your party is very good at thievery, it's going to make for a very unsuccessful chase if everything is a locked door. The book does have some suggestions for the types of chases if you wanted a short chase, maybe 6 obstacles, which should take about 10 to 20 minutes of game time. Medium chase, which would be 8 obstacles, which is about 15 to 25 minutes of game time. And long chase, which would be 10 obstacles, or about 20 to 30 minutes of game time. These are kind of broad numbers. If you have a really role play heavy group, it could take a lot longer. And if you have a group that just likes to roll and skip the narrative, then it could go a lot quicker. But those would be the guidelines you'd kind of want to work with. Now, as far as setting obstacle DCs, there are some example obstacles in the Game Mastery Guide, so it's always good to look at those. If you can use those, great. If you can see one similar to what you are thinking of, then it is a good guideline for how to set your DCs. But you would want to use a proficiency rank that's generally appropriate for the player characters at the level they are at that time. If you are trying to create a very hard chase scene, then you could elevate those DCs. And if you are just trying to add a little bit of tension, you could lower the DCs, but increase the amount of chase points needed in order to overcome an obstacle. There are many ways that you can vary setting the obstacle DCs, but unless you definitely want the players to get caught, which narratively could make sense in your story, I would not suggest setting the DCs at 25 for a level 1 party, because it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to overcome that. Now, since running the chase is not quite as interactive with the players, in other words, they aren't worried so much about their initiative order and when they go, and if they need to delay so that this person can get this particular buffing spell off before they do their action, it is helpful to narrate the scene a lot more in order to kind of give them a feeling on what they're going through. Encourage the player characters to describe what they're doing as much as possible, and give them bonus points for creative uses of the skills they have. In a lot of cases, it is nice to let the player characters know what DCs they're trying to beat. It kind of brings a lot of fun to the table, for me at least, and it is a suggestion from the Game Mastery Guide itself. But if the player characters know what they have to beat, it kind of gets everybody involved. There isn't a whole bunch of reason to keep this secret, especially after the first person succeeds, then they're going to kind of know what the DC is. If they are doing something similar that would require the same check, if necessary, you could use visual aids for this. It could be just a series of index cards that have obstacle 1, obstacle 2, obstacle 3, obstacle 4, and then you flip them over as you get to it with a description of what that particular obstacle is, even including the stat block if that's what's needed. You could also do something similar in Foundry or Roll20 or Alchemy or any of the virtual tabletops by just using not the 5 grid close-ups, but just a big overview of the city, port, forest, cave system, dungeon, whatever you're running this chase scene through, and marking on that where these particular obstacles would be, and then just move the player characters to the next obstacle once they overcome one. And if a player character group gets stuck, it is helpful to have a number of tries that you are willing to allow them to attempt before you just kind of let them move through. You don't have to. Once again, it is fine for the player characters to get caught and it wouldn't TPK the entire party, feel free to let the characters get caught. But usually the suggestion is after 3 tries, then they get to move through to the next obstacle. All at your discretion. That is just the suggestion from the Game Mastery Guide. Also in the Game Mastery Guide, there is a whole list of sample obstacles. I'm not really going to run through those. That is something you can look up yourself. And it would take a lot of time in the video, and I don't think very many people would sit through me reading those off a page. So I will go ahead and include a link to that in the description, as well as the page number in the Game Mastery Guide for you. Now, I hope this guide on chases was helpful for you. Maybe give you some ideas. I like to see chases, and I feel that in my play, I don't see them enough, and I would like to add them more whenever I decide to game master. They definitely add a different flavor to a session. They add a different color to it. And if you have been doing the same dungeon for 10 sessions in a row, sometimes it's nice to do something different for a session in order to bring a little life back to the table. I hope you did like the video, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.